I'm Vicki Hoth, Education Coordinator for Handy Quilter. I'm here at the American Patchwork and Quilting Crafts Lab, and we are going to learn all about feathers today. There are three parts to stitching a feather. The feather itself, then the boundary is to know where to put it, and the spine. Now the spine is really important. Where does that feather land? Where does it go, the next feather? So we need those three parts. So let's look at the feather itself. It's one way to draw it. Some draw it this way. Now the next thing is that boundary. This feather circle has a boundary here, but there's also this imaginary boundary right around here because I wanted to keep it circular. I didn't want it to go out into those edges. Now let's look at this one. This one, the boundary, the feathers, they go right out to the edge. Now there's also another boundary right there in the center. It gives me kind of a space that I can leave blank, or I could maybe put some stippling or pebbles with that. Now the third thing we're talked about is the spine. And this is pretty obvious. There's a spine right there. And that gives me an indication as to where I need to put the next feather. So as I draw my feather, or as I quilt my feather, let's get that thread out of the way. As I quilt that feather, I know where I need to go for the next feather to let it land and then keep quilting. So there's my spine, the feather, and the boundary. Now that's a circular feather, or it's feather in a square block that fills it. But let's talk about some other shapes. So let's look at this. A triangle. Where's my boundary? Obviously this is my boundary. Where's my spine? Well, there's some different spines that you could use. We could put a spine right like this. So there'd be feathers on both sides. So you could start with your feathers down here and draw on this side, and then come back and work your feathers on this side, okay? Or let's move over to this triangle. This line right here could actually be my spine. So and here's my boundary, see there's the boundary. As I stitch those feathers, there's my spine. And I may not have even needed to stitch that spine because maybe that was the piecing in a block. Again, I can fill those feathers right in, and there it is. Okay, now I could use this line as a spine. So any one of those lines could be a spine. Now, did you see this block right here? That is a full block, but I've kind of drawn some lines through it that if I wanted to say, oh, that's a full block, I could put a feather in it. But I don't know how to do a square feather, and I don't want to do a circular like this. I've drawn those lines, and I could take this feather and I could do the same type. Now as we come up here, I'm going to look at that and say, good, I left myself enough to get a feather up into the point. Oh yes, this is working really well. It's going nice. Okay, and there, look how nice that's looking. Okay, now I got a question for you. I want you to see this one. This is my circle. We'll go back to the circle. I have my boundary. I have my spine. Who would have thought a dot would be a spine? Okay, I'm going to come up and I'm going to make a feather. I'm going to make that feather. Now, wait a minute. What am I going to do? Well, this type, I'm going to do a different type of a feather. I'm actually going to stitch back over the top of this and come back down. Back to my spine, come up, stitch over the top. So every other feather is stitched over the top. It's my travel path to get back to my spine, up to the top, over, and back to my spine. This is really turning out nice. I like that. A little wiggly there, but when I quilt it, it won't be so wiggly. Back, up. Now, Can I get 1 or 2 feathers in there? Well, depends on what you want it to look like. Let's put 1 feather back in there. That's a great big one, but it worked. It worked. There. And look, my spine, my feather, and my boundary. This is fun to put on some piece quilts that have circles in them and fill that right in. Okay, now let's stitch this out so we can see how well we drew. See if we can stay on the lines. All right, we're going to do our triangle feather first, and we're just going to go ahead and stitch. And I don't have to stay on those lines. And when we get to the base there, right there, we're going to hold just a minute. We don't ever want to have circular little circles there. We want good sharp points. So we bounce in and we bounce out. Okay, let's do it again. And if you don't touch the spine, it's okay. Okay, we're at the top of my feathers, and now I want to stitch down and then do the rest of them. So I'm going to bring up my ruler so that I can get a good straight line. Stitch right down, and if this was a seam, it would be right in the ditch. Okay, move my ruler aside, and then I'm going to go ahead and stitch my next feathers in that triangle. Get right up into that corner. And we're getting to the last feather. Okay, there it is. Now, if you took a little water, wash that off, you'd have beautiful feathers. Now, let's move on to those circular ones and the different types of feathers. Clip our threads. So we're going to start over here. This is our spine. We're starting on the spine. Do a little tie off and clip my threads so that we don't have them tied up there. Okay, so remember I started up here and then we stitch back over. I've got my boundary, I've got my spine. Let's add the feathers to it. Stitch over the top of that. Down. Now, I want to show you something. Right here, you need to make sure that you come down far enough that you leave yourself a little V. V for Vicki, right? Okay, so we're going to come back up. Drop down enough, leave ourselves. So that gives me a definition. Whoops, let's go back. We were talking, we forgot what we were doing. Back up. The next one, trace over the top or stitch over the top, down. So sometimes it's just better to draw it so that you know you're going to get the right amount of feathers, and there you go. Now this would look a lot prettier if those blue lines weren't there, but it's a good exercise in helping you get those feathers the way you want them to be. Don't let feathers frighten you. Remember, the feather, the spine, and the boundary, and let your creative juices flow and create any type of feather you want, but draw them first and then quilt over them and practice, and you will love feathers.